we can share it, so we can share it with others. Yeah, Emily, maybe we can start. If you want to say something else about yourself, if you have something to share with us, we would like to hear this.
Sure. Yeah, so I thank you so much, Yolanda, my first grade teacher.
Malka, right?
You, who started my love for Hebrew at a very young age. So yes, thank you so much for hosting me as well. I will say also that this came at a great time because I've been receiving a lot of different emails and messages from home about the situation here, specifically over the course of this escalation. And as a journalist, I was working very, very hard, not just for I-24 News, but for a myriad of outlets. So I wanted to answer questions and I wanted to get back to people, but I simply just didn't have the time. And then of course, afterwards, we had a government changeover and a new coalition and a new prime minister as of just Sunday, basically. So it was a very exciting news 6 weeks, I would say. And oh, is there a weird sound?
Oh. Phil, could you mute your microphone for now, because I think there is a strong Phil, Spivak? Can you mute your microphone?
You want me to mute this?
Yes, because it's we can't. It takes over our.
Okay.
Actually, I could do that from here, maybe. Okay, now it's.
Yolanda, the leader can always mute everyone else.
Yes, now I can see
But
that.
then you have to open Emily up again after you mute everyone.
Yes, mute, and I'll open Emily, and then where is Emily? Emily Rose. Okay, thank you. How could I do this? More. Ask to unmute. Okay, I won't mute everyone then, because oh, Emily, you can talk, I think.
Can everyone hear me? Is it good?
I can hear you.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, Zoom is great. I can't wait until we can actually have a real.
Yeah.
Soon, I hope so, very soon. Yes, so basically my work at I-24 News, 4.5 years, I was Middle East correspondent, and because Middle East correspondent, or because I-24 News, its niche is Israel and everything that happens in Israel, and we broadcast in English, French, and Arabic about Israel from Israel. But my niche within that was the Middle East beat, which ended up being basically Palestinian affairs. And that broke down also to Palestinians in the West Bank and all of the Palestinian territories, and of course, Arab citizens of Israel, whom I refer to as Palestinian citizens of Israel. And so that was basically my niche. And then over the course of Corona and politics and all of the elections that we've had this year, so many, I became more of a generalist and was able to branch out and cover all sorts of things, all sorts of issues here in Israel, from Corona to health issues, to politics, to, of course, the latest conflict, Guardian of the Walls, and then afterwards, all of the political drama that ensued afterwards. I will say a few things that I noticed, maybe some of my takeaways from Guardian of the Walls this time around that kind of stuck out to me. But then, of course, basically what I wanted to just do was open this up for people to ask questions. If you have any questions about the operation from a military perspective, if I can, I will answer them from my military knowledge. From a political perspective, we can talk about Palestinians, we can talk about the latest issue with the vaccines, we can talk about the political, we can talk about the new coalition, the political situations, really whatever you would like to ask me. This time was very interesting to me. You will have more of a perspective on this than I will, but I of course was frightened and saddened and terrified by the rise in anti-Semitism that I saw simultaneously happening not just, I guess, in Canada, but I also am friendly with, for example, the head of the Jewish Federation in New Zealand. And he was calling me nonstop about anti-Semitism and feeling threatened. And of course, it was interesting to see social media reactions and the reactions to the operation in Gaza, what was coming from different communities or political communities. So that was one thing that stuck out to me. It's something that I haven't really thought about in a long time, because for the past 3 military operations in Gaza, I've been here either as a journalist or a soldier. In 2008, I was a soldier. I was serving in the West Bank during that operation. I was called up in the middle of my officer's training school to go guard in a military district of the West Bank called Khatmar Binyamin, which is an area in the West Bank. And the next 2 escalations after that, I served in Home Front Command, where my job is to connect and liaison between the Arab population in Jerusalem and the military, so that we're getting proper messages out to the public so they can be prepared for emergency. And so those were my last 2 escalations. And this was basically my first major I heard someone refer to it as a warette in Israel as a journalist. And like I said, I worked over the course of this escalation with the Associated Press. I worked with a bunch of outlets in the UK. I worked with Deutsche Welle, which is a German outlet. I worked, of course, with I-24 News, and I worked with NPR, the NPR team, National Public Radio. So I was able to kind of see how each one was shaping their coverage. And that to me too, as well, was very interesting. One moment I will just mention, and this will be the last thing, then I'll open it up to questions, was the day that the media tower was bombed. And I know now we're seeing the sort of incidents of that trickle out and the response from that trickle out. But that was a very, very sort of dark and heavy day here for me as an Israeli and for me as a journalist. I was asked to speak on LBC, which is the Voice of London Radio. It's one of the largest radio stations, or the most listened to in the UK, almost right away. And I was asked, what is it like to be a journalist there and then see those towers being destroyed, basically. And of course, the details were still murky. The fog of war had clouded everything, and I said that on air. But I'm friendly, of course, with the AP bureau chief here in Jerusalem. And I remembered that in the last escalation in 2014, the AFP is the French wire service. That would be like the French version of AP. The AFP bureau in Gaza assumed, they were frightened that Hamas was moving into the building next door. And so very quickly, they alerted the Jerusalem bureau chief, who took all of his budget and he rented out a hotel in Gaza. So they burned through their entire budget and they opened up a brand new bureau in a hotel because they were so scared. They hightailed it out of there. So someone asked me, was this plausible? Could it be that the journalists knew that Hamas was in the building? And the only thing I could remember was that as soon as the AFP journalists from the last escalation thought that Hamas was moving in, not to their building, but to the building next door, they got the hell out of there. So to me, that said that they really didn't know, and it was just a very, very difficult day, both as a journalist, I would say, and as an Israeli. And I'm happy to talk about that as well. So anyway, I would love to hear questions if people have, and we can go in different directions. I will answer to the best of my knowledge. And if not, maybe I can refer you to smarter people than me. So we can do that too.
So I will start, Emily. In your opinion, what do you think were the main reasons that started this latest round of war or operation? Everybody has a different name for it. And I'm just going to mute everyone. So this is mute everyone, but I want to do unmute. So how do I do that? Mute all, cancel. Okay, I don't know how to unmute.
Emily can unmute herself.
Okay, can you guys can unmute yourself?
Oh, there we go. Thanks.
Okay,
Me
good.
too.
I didn't even see you there. That's why I miss
Okay.
it. In person soon.
So go
So what started this escalation? So in the weeks leading up to this escalation, this war Jerusalem was very tense. I was there almost every day, and it was Ramadan. And around Ramadan, there tends to be some air of tension in Jerusalem anyway. Tension in Jerusalem and tension in the West Bank. And one major cause of tension were these gates that were put up at Damascus Gate. To this day, so Damascus Gate is like this. People walk out of the gate, and around it is this area where during Ramadan, when you're done fasting, of course, the worshipers come out into this area that are basically steps leading down to Damascus Gate. And they sometimes sell things, they sell food and drinks. There's sometimes dancing and drum circles and celebrating, because Ramadan basically looks like Christmas, right? There are lights, there's a market, people buy new clothes for their children. And what the Israeli military had done, and to this day it's still unclear to me because I asked what exactly was the specific reason for this, but they had put up gates to ensure that people didn't loiter in that area. Now, were there safety concerns? That's what they say. I guess that this was a security concern. Perhaps they were trying to monitor how many people went in. They did allow for people to come from the West Bank, given that they met with Corona restrictions, etc. But that was a cause, either way, however it breaks down, that was a cause of tension for the locals there. In Jerusalem, they didn't like that. And already when I remember standing there one day, someone asked me the other day, what was your most fearful moment over the course of all of this coverage, right? From rockets to riots. And I said that day, I really did think that someone was gonna get shot by accident, because the police are standing on these giant towers and they're looking down over this system. It's being blocked off by gates, but kids are still hopping over because this is just like their backyard. So they're just hopping over. The police are like, no, go back, go back, go back. And I thought someone was gonna get confused and shoot somebody. And then there were riots. I myself got sprayed with a water cannon, which was lovely. And so already the tension was building in the weeks leading up to this escalation. Then ensued the issue of Sheikh Jarrah, which is a cluster of families, right, that live in these 4 homes that are slated to be, they're under court decision that has now been delayed and delayed and delayed, but slated for eviction. And there are different takes on this. So I will say that there are some who say that the residents, the local residents who live in these homes, were in discussions with the Jewish families to kind of share these homes in like a custody agreement, but the Palestinian Authority threatened them and told them not to do it, so they didn't enter into those agreements. The Palestinians, of course, say that there's no reason for these evictions, these claims from before 48. If you opened up claims before 48, you would end up displacing lots of people, Jews and Arabs, and there's no reason for them to be evicted. Either way, when you're standing there at these homes, you see how close they are to one Jewish home in this Arab neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah that was only made Jewish when settlers moved into it in 2009. So already the tension was building. There was one night I was there on a Friday night, the Ramadan feast was happening outside these Sheikh Jarrah Arab homes. They were having a big Ramadan feast, iftar, and right across from it, they were praying for Kabbalat Shabbat with these settlers, and they were so close, and there was a big wall of police in a tiny narrow street standing in between them to try to make sure that they didn't clash with one another. And of course there were protests. And I even saw a journalist, a Haredi journalist, almost get hit in the face by a stun grenade being thrown by police. And then that night, of course, that same night that I just mentioned to you, riots ensued on the Temple Mount. So the tension was building. And then if we look at the reason I mentioned Jerusalem is because everyone has labeled this a Jerusalem issue. Hamas, from the beginning, labeled this war the sword of Jerusalem. This was an event that needed to defend Jerusalem. Come the day of the flag march, which for Jews marked the reunification of the city, and when Jews asserted, or when Israelis asserted sovereignty over the other parts of the city that weren't there before 1948, That's that flag march for Arab citizens of Jerusalem, for Palestinian citizens of Jerusalem. That's a very hard day. It means that the police go in, they close off all of the shops in Damascus Gate, and they make sure that those Jewish worshipers can walk through that Arab quarter. They go through Damascus Gate, they go through the Arab quarter. I've seen them myself in past years close down those shops, close down their businesses, make them go home. It's already a very tense day. I'm standing there reporting on this flag march, and we are in this concert outside the Great Synagogue in Jerusalem, which is where this flag march is supposed to go through. And we're waiting to find out if the police are going to let these worshipers go through Damascus Gate. I'm on air. There's music blasting because there's dancing in the street. We're still waiting and waiting and waiting. We were supposed to start walking towards the old city about an hour ago. We're still waiting to hear what the decision is. Khan Media, which is the Israeli public broadcast, is reporting that it's been canceled. Someone else is reporting that they can't go through Damascus Gate. They're going to change the route and go around. And I'm on air, and there's music, and we start hearing sirens go off in Jerusalem. And those are the first sirens that go off in Jerusalem since the last major escalation. And then we understand that something very different has happened. And something very different is about to happen. No one knows where to go, so I stay on air because I say there's nowhere I can run, of course. So I'm just going to stay on air and we'll film what's happening around us. We hear very loud explosions in the distance, and that begins the escalation. So the escalation, in quotation marks, started in Jerusalem. That was ground zero. If you want to talk about the Palestinian politics and the politics on the Israeli side, those could also be seen as an impetus. Palestinian officials, political officials, one of them being Yahya Sinwar, they just hosted local Palestinian elections for Hamas. He did not come out exactly the victor initially, and then that changed, and he did become the victor by, he magically won, even though he didn't, win in terms of his support. So you were looking down the barrel of a politically weak Hamas. Just about an hour before I was standing there as the siren went off in Jerusalem, Yair Lapid and now Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett were about to sign a coalition deal that would see Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu unseated for 12 years in office. So that was something that people were throwing around and saying there are political motivations on both sides. So if you want to put it that way, you can. Either way, the label of this, the label for the reason of this escalation from Hamas was Jerusalem, and the way Israelis label it is that they were responding to that rocket that was fired at Jerusalem, and then of course the rockets that were fired afterwards, and they were deep into Israeli territory. They were of course in Tel Aviv, and so on and so forth. So that is on the face of it, prima facie, that was how it was labeled, was that it started in Jerusalem.
So basically there was not a specific incident, it's just like building up with all the incidents that you
Yes.
mentioned, yeah.
I will say that Hamas threatened and said, if you take this flag march through Damascus Gate, we will start firing rockets. Now that's a really messed up equation for Israel, right? Because if Israel starts capitulating to threats that Hamas is delivering about where people are allowed to walk in Jerusalem, that's a very big problem, right? You can't establish that rapport, some security professionals would say. On the other hand, that march through, there were many Israeli security analysts here even before that, who said marching through Damascus Gate right now, and police officials and security officials, who said marching through Damascus Gate right now is just too inflammatory. What you're looking at is throwing a match into a tinderbox. It's all going to explode. So it's not a good idea, so you should change the route. And there were many security professionals who had said to the political level, change the route, change the route, change the route, because you're going to see an escalation. I'll let you decide what you would do in that situation.
Well, I'm wondering, I want to open it to questions from our participants. Anybody want to ask a question?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to ask about what specifically happened. There was reports of Israeli soldiers infiltrating a mosque, and although no one died, given that it's perceived as extremely sacred, what specifically happened in that mosque, and why did the Israeli soldiers infiltrate that mosque?
I don't know which mosque you're referring to. I know that that night that I was telling you about on the Temple Mount, there were, you can't call it an infiltration into the mosque, but certainly in the complex around, right, in the area around, I don't know if you've ever been to the Temple Mount. I've been there maybe a handful of times in my life, but that night, and this is still unclear to me to this day, because I was standing at Sheikh Jarrah, but I have friends who are reporters who were standing at the Temple Mount. And they said, you got to get over here. There are stun grenades going off. No one could really tell what the impetus was. But then riots ensued that night, and it basically escalated the tension. This, by the way, is something quite indicative of Guardians of the Galaxy. I call it Guardians of the Galaxy. I keep calling Guardians of the Galaxy. Guardians of the Walls. Horrible name. Guardians of the Walls, which is different than what we've seen in escalations in the past. Escalations in the past, you can really put your finger sometimes on what it was: the kidnapping of 3 boys, and then the burning and the murder of Abu Khadir in the forest, or Lebanon, right? When we looked at Lebanon too, the abduction of Israeli soldiers, and that sparked the war, right? This wasn't like that. This was a steady incline of tension in Jerusalem, which, like I said, was little moves, putting up a gate or bringing this court case in Sheikh Jarrah back into the fore, which again, I still don't know the result of, and you still don't know the result of. It looks like the court is dragging its feet and could drag its feet who knows how long, right? But it seemed to be little moves that were sort of inflating the tension. There's another issue here, which is a bit of inside baseball for internal Palestinian politics. But the Palestinian Authority had said that they were going to hold elections, presidential elections. And Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas had said that he would hold free and fair elections for the Palestinian people in May. He knows that that's not a good idea, because Hamas is very powerful and popular, both in Gaza and in the West Bank. And I can talk more about that in a minute. But he knew that that was not a good idea. And when I spoke to diplomats, and really diplomats from now I'm talking about diplomats from Arab countries in the region, and I'm talking about diplomats from international bodies, they had come to him and said, please, there's an echo.
Yeah. Don't know who is it. Bill, maybe it's your microphone.
I was hoping to ask a question.
Oh, sure. Just one moment. I'll just finish really quickly about this point, and then definitely. There's a bit of an anyway, he had said he was going to host elections, and he didn't. He ended up delaying them, and that was again. And if you ask members of the political, for instance, the Likud, there were a lot of members of Likud, senior political leaders in Israel, Israeli political leaders, who had said the impetus here and what started this was that the Palestinian Authority didn't hold those elections that it said it was going to, and that was what caused the tension. In my mind, I can't point to one thing. I can say that it was the perfect recipe for disaster, looking back, and that's just a very, we don't have hindsight yet. We're way too close. But right now, it looks as though every one of those incidents was basically asking for disaster. And I can tell you that the day after this escalation, when I walked around Jerusalem and I spoke to Palestinians in Jerusalem, and this has never happened to me before. First of all, when I was reporting on air, I heard behind me young people, young Palestinians, and when I say young Palestinians, 17, 18, 16 years old, that age. And they were shouting the names of Palestinian Islamic Jihad commanders who had fired rockets at Tel Aviv. And they were shouting the names of Hamas commanders as well. So there's no doubt in my mind that Hamas really won in this escalation. Their popularity rose. And before, if I told you, if we go back to my first answer, at the beginning of this escalation, they were kind of looking down the barrel of losing their political clout. And afterwards, the political leader of Hamas named Ismail Haniyeh basically just went on a world tour of Arab countries. I called it his victory tour, bit cynical. But Hamas really, their popularity was bolstered across the West Bank. There were riots the next day that were support riots of Hamas. The Palestinian Authority usually stops those. They didn't. They just let them ride. And Hamas gained popularity certainly in Jerusalem. I spoke to shopkeepers just at Damascus Gate, and I said, how do you feel about this? And they're like, finally, the Palestinian issue and our plight and our struggle here as second-class citizens or residents has been brought to the fore, and it's because of Hamas. So they were very happy with Hamas. And there are many who say that if the Palestinian Authority hosted elections tomorrow, Hamas would win. So yeah, and if you send me the details, that did not answer your question, but if you send me the details of this mosque that you say was infiltrated, I can look into it. I just don't know the specific incident you're referring to.
Okay, I think we're gonna let Phil ask a question because his microphone is very loud. Yes, Phil?
Sorry about that. From an outsider point of view, an observer, it seemed to me like it was a setup of a perfect storm, that we had Ramadan and Eid ending on Jerusalem Day, which is always good to celebrate the tensions there. You've got the Mahmoud Abbas is having problems on his popularity following the Abraham Accords, that suddenly he's becoming less and less relevant to anything. You've got the imams or mullahs or whatever during Ramadan encouraging their holy worshippers to bring rocks and Molotov cocktails into Al-Aqsa Mosque in preparation for raining down on the Jewish worshippers at the Western Wall. And you've got Hamas looking for any and all opportunities to launch 4,400 rockets at Israel. So it seems to me that this whole thing was set up front. Is that not on the mark?
I understand that there are a lot of people who maybe if they look at it, and like I said, I agree with you that it was the perfect storm for that tension. And there are those who say that, yeah, they blame political leadership for not quelling those tensions and not doing what they could to kind of walk the parties back from this escalation. I have no idea if it was a brainchild of political leaders. That's not a question that I expect to look into even because I understand that it's an assumption and it's a fair assumption. But I sort of, as a journalist, we want to report something and then we want the burden of proof and to kind of verify. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know that I would ever be able to really verify that. But we don't know. Again, when we talk about the fog of war, it's very soon after the incident. And we may learn things in the future that we just don't know today. I was pretty fortunate in the sense, news fortunate, but unfortunate perhaps, that on my very first week on this job was the first incident on the Israel-Gaza border since 2014. And I hadn't even been trained. I just didn't do any training. They just sent me right to the border and said, stand there and report on it. And it was an infiltration of Gazans or an attempted infiltration into a kibbutz.
Okay.
And so I've watched this relationship between Israel and Hamas go ebb and flow, I would say. And this seemed to be perhaps their toughest moment yet over the course of these past 4 years. But to say that it was set up in advance, maybe I don't know. Maybe we'll have to see, I guess.
Thank you, Emily. Any more questions?
Yes, Yolanda, I have a question for Emily.
Is that
Earl Ashkin. We met in the bank in Israel.
Oh, haha.
Next to you.
Many years ago.
That's right. When I was on the JNF tour, when I was taking a week extra after the JNF tour, right?
Oh, wow, what a throwback.
Okay, visiting family there in Israel when I was there. Okay, I want two questions. How do the Muslims resent Israeli presence in Jerusalem? How do the Christian Arabs and the Armenians feel about Jewish control. And two, I hear a question about the border police, Mishmar HaGvul. I hear about half of them are Arabs, Druze, Bedouins, Christians, and the other half are Mizrahi Jews. Is that correct? My estimation of the border police who are guarding it. Yes.
Yeah, I'll answer the first question because that's my favorite, always. 'Cause
Right.
I love talking about the Christian community in Jerusalem, which is vibrant and beautiful. Armenians today is a sensitive topic for Armenians in Jerusalem because there has recently been a conflict between, of course, Armenia and Azerbaijan, and it's made public that Israel is supplying the Azeris with the weapons that are being used to bomb parts of Armenia. And full communities and these ancient churches just being decimated. It's absolutely heartbreaking. And if you want more information on that, I'm glad to give it to you. I myself am in close contact with the Armenian Patriarch in Jerusalem. And it's a very fine balance that he has to walk because I know that he wants his community to feel at home and welcome and integrated into a beautiful mosaic Jerusalem. But Israel does not recognize the Armenian genocide as the United States just took that brave step to do recently with the Biden administration. And that compiles or compounded by the fact that Israel has been aiding and is seen as aiding the Azeris in killing Armenians and destroying their homes. It's quite frightening. And there have been protests by the Armenian community, both here in Jaffa, where I live, and in Jerusalem. Over the course of this escalation and how Christians in Jerusalem fit into this escalation, I believe that there were a lot of Christians in Jerusalem who sort of sympathized very much, Arab Christians as well, Palestinian Christians, sympathized with the plight of Palestinians in Jerusalem, specifically when it came to Sheikh Jarrah and the idea that you could just get an eviction notice and have to be moved from your homes. Certainly the Palestinians are Christians across the West Bank, which is also a very vibrant community, but it's shrinking massively, both in Bethlehem and in Ramallah. I would say that they probably fit politically into what I was talking about before, that trend of supporting Hamas, because Hamas seems to be making gains for the Palestinian cause, as they see it. And then your second question was about the border police. And I don't know how the percentages break up exactly, so I don't know the numbers exactly. But yes, Druze do serve a lot in Jerusalem. Druze border police and Arab-speaking border police are quite common, specifically around Damascus Gate. And I was there one night, this was the night that I got sprayed, but I was there one night when there were the gates, and there were protests against the gates. And I thought, okay, everything is staying calm right now. People aren't really making any messes. It's just a few kind of rabble-rousers here and there. And then the border police gets up on the loudspeaker and he starts speaking Arabic, but you can tell that it's a little bit of a different, it's hard to explain, but it's a bit of a different pronunciation. Yeah, it's kind of like a different pronunciation to some of the words. So you can tell that it's not local Jerusalem Arabic. And so they know that it's border police because he's standing in a border police truck with a border police megaphone, and he says, "Everyone, stay calm. We want you to stay calm. If you stay calm, everything will stay calm." And I'm like, this guy does not have a wife, because if you tell your wife to stay calm, the first thing she does is, "Don't tell me to stay calm," and she gets mad. And that's exactly what happened. People started to, "Don't tell me to stay calm. I don't want to stay calm," and they started to sort of cause tensions. And then there were a few clashes, not violent ones, thank God, between Palestinians and the police. And that's just to give you a sense of the tension and how high that tension is. How those police officers are viewed in the face of Palestinians, Palestinian citizens of Israel and Palestinian residents of Jerusalem, that's a very interesting topic. I think you could do a whole doctorate on that topic. But I would gather that for the most part, the feeling for a Palestinian who's living in East Jerusalem and a Palestinian who's living in the West Bank is that it doesn't matter what language that individual speaks, they have a bad rapport and a bad relationship with security. And so that's always going to cause some kind of fear for them. That would be my take, but it's a very interesting, I'm certainly probably not speaking for everybody, and it's a very interesting topic. So yeah,
Okay, thank you.
I think you could probably write a doctorate on that.
Okay.
Let's see if there are more questions.
I have a question.
Oh,
I
okay.
think Faye has a question as well.
Yeah, let Faye ask a question.
Okay, first of all, when are you coming home?
All
right.
In October.
We can talk about that later. One of the things I watched on the news was as I saw these demonstrations of in Akko and in Jerusalem and in Yaffo. I mean, you saw all these things that some of them were reported as populist uprising of demonstrations of people who were really upset. And some of them there were items that showed people being trucked in from other places into a community where it wasn't the actual local residents who were demonstrating, who were, and I wondered how populist it really was compared to the news item to me, and some of these visuals looked like what we saw in Black Lives Matters last year, where people had been trucked in from elsewhere to cause trouble.
Great.
Things. So how much of it was populist and how much of it was rabble rousers who were going around actually instigating trouble?
Yeah, so this was another major piece, and I'm so glad you mentioned it because I should have mentioned it. But this was something that really set this apart from all, and remember, I was in Jerusalem when Muhammad Abu Khadr was taken to a forest and lynched. And I saw the train stop being torn apart by Arab residents of East Jerusalem who were so angry at that. But this was a different scale. And I live in Jaffa, which is a mixed neighborhood. And I reported in Lod and I reported in Akko and these cities. While this was happening, there were riots across these mixed towns. And that was something that we've never seen the likes of. And if you're asking me what I'm more afraid of, it was that. So there was one day, and this is what you were seeing with the trucks and the buses. There was one day when Palestinians, and this is Palestinians across Israel, and this is Palestinians across the West Bank, and Palestinians in Gaza, decided to host a general strike to show solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza, but also Palestinians everywhere. And they hosted a general strike, and that is something we've also never seen, that kind of unity among the Palestinian people, at least in my lifetime. I haven't really seen anything like that just yet because Palestinian factions still remain quite divided. But on this, they were united. They had a strike, and here it was peaceful protests. There were flags, there were political leaders, local political leaders who spoke, there was chanting, there was music, and it was a political strike. It was a peaceful demonstration of protest, and Arab shops here stayed closed for several days after as a sign of protest. And that's when you saw buses, because they wanted to bring people to these sites where there were these main protest sites happening. And they really were demonstrations. If you look at I can show you images because they really are burned in my mind now, of Ramallah and Menara Square, which is the central square in Ramallah, which I've been to now maybe dozens of times, maybe more. And normally, and I'm usually there for protests. I was there on Annexation Day, and I was there on the day that Trump inaugurated Trump Heights, and I was there, I wasn't there on Embassy Day, but I was there after when they moved the embassy. And I've been there for lots of different kinds of protests in Menara, and it's usually maybe 100 people, and they kind of march around the square, and then they come back to the central square. In Ramallah, they march through the market, and they come back. And when you look at pictures of that day, that general strike, it was packed. You couldn't get an elbow in. So that was a day when the general strike of the Palestinian people just stuck in everyone's mind just because of the mass of people. And I'm sure they bused Palestinians in from local villages and they brought them all to the city. This was something everybody could get behind that day. But that was remarkable in terms of if you're looking at the historical, whatever, progress of this. Now, was it populist? The riots itself were, I'll put it this way. Last week, or I guess 2 weeks ago, my last week at I-24, I went to a meeting in Akko, which was the chief rabbi of Israel. It was amazing. It was like the beginning of a bad joke. It was a rabbi, an imam, and a priest, and it really was, walk into a hotel and start to try to talk about how they're going to deal with issues in Akko, this mixed city where, if I'll remind you, a theater was burnt down, a theater that was a symbol of coexistence was burnt down, and Uri Buri, which is a very famous fish restaurant, it's owned by a Jew, but it's all of its employees are Arab, was completely destroyed, arson, and a hotel, lots of other places were targeted, property was targeted. And so the chief rabbi came and he got the local rabbi of Akko, together with the head of the Greek Orthodox community and the Baha'i representative, because there are very holy Baha'i sites in Akko, and of course the local imam. And they're trying to have this discussion, what do we do, what do we do? And the rabbi gives this very impassioned speech about how we need to speak to the youth and teach them. And I just remember the imam saying, they won't listen to us anymore. They're not really listening to us. And this is something that a lot of people were talking about in these riots, that you have a group of kind of older generation who perhaps could be talked into reason, but then a younger generation of, and then like I said, 17, 16, 18-year-old youth who are using TikTok. There was the whole issue with hateful videos on TikTok of attacking Jews and attacking Haredim in Jerusalem. And youth at these very violent events. Mm-hmm. So I would say perhaps that the riots and the strikes and the protests, those are gaining popular clout, and they're also gaining support from Jews who sympathize with the Palestinian cause in Israel. So Israeli Jews. Mm-hmm. But then those incidents of violence, when you speak to people on the ground, what they say is that it was a few idiots. That's how they refer to it. They say it was a few bad apples, basically, who were lighting something on fire and causing violence. And that to me is very, very, very scary, because you've had a year where kids were not in school, first of all. And you have had several years where a lot of these Palestinian youth have felt they've seen their communities be overrun by gun violence or drug violence, all of the above. There's been a degradation of infrastructure here, and here we can talk about the new coalition if we like, but there has been a neglect, over a decade of neglect of infrastructure in these Arab communities. And so these kids have watched that progress. I don't know yet to correlate between the two, and it's definitely not an excuse for lighting anyone's business on fire. But to me, it was a wake-up call for people at the top level, that it reminded me of Langston Hughes. It reminded me of A Raisin in the Sun, where what happens to a dream deferred, and then in the end of the poem it explodes, right? So when you look at that progression, it seems to be the youth, and that was a very scary meeting for me. I covered it. I did a feature on it. It seemed very beautiful to have all of these religious leaders talking about what they're going to do. But ultimately, when you have this imam, this very well-respected imam in Akko, say, these kids won't listen to me, it's frightening. So, so it's something that the new coalition is really going to have to face head on. And if you look at Naftali Bennett's speech, which was interrupted many times, but one of the issues that he addressed was that speech, for sure. It was that issue in his speech. So hopefully.
You think it's true that it's also the rabbis they're not listening, the Jewish youth aren't listening to the rabbi either?
It very well could be. If we're talking about the Armenians, dear God, last time I went to do a report 2 years ago about the Armenian, a ceremony that was being held for the Armenian genocide, survivors of the Armenian genocide. And a bulk of the community in Jerusalem are survivors of the genocide. They're descendants of survivors. And someone had written, Christ is a liar, on the outside of the church, of the Armenian church. And there are cameras everywhere. And they had gone to the police and said, can you do something about this? And the police were still looking at it. And that's months and months and months. Right? So there's a feeling, there's a disconnect. There's a lack of trust between law enforcement, is what I'm seeing. It's obviously delicate, because law enforcement going into an Arab village and not having the support of the local leadership there is also problematic. So you're looking at a very sticky, tricky situation. but now, after this escalation, this war, I believe that it will be more on the radar, or at least I think so.
So, yeah. Bradley?
Yeah, I think that I think on Fareed Zakaria, GPS, they had an Arab a journalist who was reporting there, and she brought up the issue of there are a lot of Arab gangs that have sort of taken over villages, and the Arab community has looked upon the Israeli police to help out, and the Israeli police haven't been there for the communities. But at the same time, I would think the Arab communities have their own law enforcement officials that would look after the law enforcement of the individual Arab villages. Is
You're
that not
talking
correct?
about criminal activity in the Arab villages.
No, when it comes to criminal activity, I mean, I've interviewed, I don't know how well you know the villages in the north, but there's a major village called Sahnin. It's one of the largest Arab villages, I guess, in the Galilee. And there are about 5 mayors in that area of different Arab towns in that area. Arabe is one of them. And I spoke to him about guns, and he said, I have a message. He said this to the camera. Normally when you do an interview, you're supposed to look at the interviewer, not at the camera. But he looked right at the camera and he said, I have a message for the Israeli police. Come take our guns, because I can't do it. We have guns running around here. It's the Wild West. We have unmarked guns that are brought in from every border, and they're being stored all across these communities and sold and traded. So come take our guns. I'm asking you to come take our guns. And I was at a funeral this year, I guess 4 months ago, of a 12-year-old boy, the 14-year-old boy was killed, and the 12-year-old boy was severely injured. And I was at his funeral at an Arab town in the north, and he was killed right outside a police station. It means that in this community, it means that the locals who are selling these guns, these thugs, they really don't care about police. They don't give a damn. If they're willing to shoot a 14-year-old boy outside a police station, they don't care. They don't care about law enforcement, or there isn't a presence of law enforcement that they feel is actually care worthy. But in terms of having their local autonomy and being able to have a local police force, that is in the West Bank. In Palestinian territories, you have the Palestinian Authority, which shares security cooperation with Israel. But when it comes to Palestinian citizens of Israel and Arab villages, no, they do need the Israeli police or at least the leadership has said in the past, please come and intervene.
Mhm.
We'll have to see what happens now with Mansour Abbas. This is a very interesting development for Israel in the history of Israel. We have an Islamist party in the government, and he has not run on a platform of Islam. I can speak a little bit about it if anyone is interested. But there are basically 2 Islamist movements in Israel. You've got the southern branch and the northern branch, those main branches. The northern branch has in the past been affiliated and has been really connected to some scary terrorist organizations like Hezbollah, Iranian-backed militias, and the southern branch tends to be a little bit more moderate. But either way, they are and Mansour Abbas hails from the southern branch. But this Islamist party is kind of a culmination of that movement in Israel. And they are an Islamist group. Every move that Mansour Abbas makes, even politically, he has to consult an Islamist council. So they are Islamist. But they ran on a platform, and I've interviewed Mansour Abbas, they ran on a platform of dealing with that issue: crime, infrastructure, education. That was though they said his kind of mode, MO, Mansour Abbas, is we're going to deal with all of the other stuff later. If we disagree on religion, if we disagree on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, if we disagree on all those things, we're going to deal with that later. What we need to deal with now is gun violence. What we need to deal with now is education for Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel. What we need to deal with now is the ability for Palestinian villages to expand and build and grow. But he, and now he's in the governing coalition. So that, stay tuned, right? But a very interesting, a very historic moment for Israel, absolutely. So we'll see if those issues get dealt with. I don't know.
Yeah, I think time goes so quickly when it's so interesting. But
Yeah.
so we have time for maybe 2 more questions.
Okay.
And I think I saw Phil, where did he go? He wanted to ask something.
Okay.
I don't know, he's gone. Yes, and Earl, did you want to
Yeah,
ask?
more of a personal question to Emily. One is about, through your appearance, can you pass as a Palestinian Arab when you're in an Arab environment? And two, how's your grasp of Arabic? You know Arabic well to some extent.
Yeah, I can speak Arabic. In terms of translating, I don't rely on myself to do direct translations because I would usually, and I come from I-24 News, we have a third of our staff are Palestinian. I've conducted interviews in Arabic, but I don't trust myself to translate or report in Arabic.
Okay.
I never present myself as a Palestinian, never, never. And I actually, when I'm in the West Bank, tend to speak in English first. Because first of all, you go to a city like Ramallah or Bethlehem and everyone speaks English anyway.
Oh,
But it diffuses the situation in a certain way. When they hear that you're a foreigner, especially Canadians, Canadians, we have a great reputation, I believe. So yeah, I do get mistaken. I absolutely do get mistaken for Palestinian. I absolutely do. I think they look at me and the first thing they think is that I'm Palestinian. But once they hear my accent in Arabic or they hear me speak English, they're like, where are you from? Where's your family from? They assume that I'm Palestinian in my origin, yeah. But I always correct that and say, yeah, they were refugees from Poland.
well,
Yeah.
I would never have that problem. I'm mistaken for everything but Middle Easterner,
Right.
every part of Europe.
If we don't, I have a question, Emily. I mean, actually, I have 2 questions, and I know I said 2 last questions, but it will be 3. So the first one is during the operation, and even today, we see the rise in anti-Semitism in Canada and around the world. And part of it is because how the media report what is happening in Israel. And I'm wondering if you know, why is it that they get it so one-sided? Why is it that they only report one side, or mostly the headlines are more pro-Palestinian and less empathetic towards Israel? And in my opinion, it creates more anti-Semitism. And the other question that I have is, before we conclude, is are you optimistic, or what do you see for the future?
Okay, so I'm very friendly with foreign correspondents from almost every major media outlet here, from the Financial Times to the Wall Street Journal to Fox News. Fox News correspondent here is a good friend. I basically friends with all of them, and I actually worked for NPR over the course of this escalation. So the relationship with the media in Israel and the Israeli authorities and the Israeli military is a very complicated one, and I would say that it is a loaded one. For example, this time around, and I'm sure you saw this, but the military lied to the press and said that the Israeli military was going in on a ground operation. And when reporters, who it is their job to confirm and verify, called the Israeli military spokesman, Jonathan Conricus, and said, we hear that there's going to be a ground operation because 2 other outlets are reporting that. Can you confirm? He said yes. So they both gave that message to the press and then doubled down on it and lied.
So it wasn't just a vague statement that somebody misunderstood. There was a deliberate.
No, and I saw Conricus do an interview on CNN later where he said, well, it was a fog of war and I was confused. But there were reporters from the New York Times who called and said, is there a ground operation? And he confirmed and said yes.
But there was good political reasons and military reasons for lying to the press.
Okay, so here is a very interesting dilemma, right? Because Aviv Kochavi, who is the military chief of staff in Israel, he's known kind of as a trickster. He really likes mind games. That's one of his, I would say, that's part of his brand. As an officer, watching his career and on the northern border as well, and in Wars in the Past, that's his brand. He likes to play mind games, and this was one of them. When I got the call at night, the night before, about a ground operation, and I looked at the message, but then I could kind of calculate in my head how many ground troops had been deployed to the region, and I did not estimate in my analysis there were enough ground troops that had been called up to actually go through with a ground operation. So I sort of cast a doubt. But here lies a very interesting dilemma that I've had discussions and I've heard people argue from here to there. There were many Israelis who said that was brilliant. He used the media to get Hamas into their fighting position, and then he attacked them. And honestly, Hamas probably isn't that concerned about foreign media. What they do watch, which nothing gets past them, is Israeli media. Hamas knows every word of Israeli media. They are monitoring it all the time. So likely the message was more intended to get into Israeli media, so they would absorb it, get into their fighting positions, and then they would be able to cast an attack or whatever as a military tactic. So there are many people here who had said, oh, that was brilliant. But then if you look at it on the other side, the media has a very important role to play here, right? They are they're kind of the referees, and they're the verifiers. So for example, let's take an example. The Israeli military says that it didn't bomb schools or hospitals or places where civilians gather, but that it really did bomb Hamas military positions. And the places that were both those places were because Hamas was storing weapons in those places. Now, the only journalists who are allowed into Gaza while the bombing is happening are the journalists who are already there. Right? So who's there to verify? Not that many journalists, right? I heard an interview with the bureau chief of the Financial Times on the Haaretz podcast, where he said, I don't know if that's true or not. I don't know if what the Israeli military is saying is true or not. If I were in Gaza, if I were allowed to go to Gaza while the bombing was happening, I would verify for you. I would go there and look into it. I would ask people, I would take pictures. I would have a film crew. I would go to all lengths to try to verify that for you, because that's my job as a journalist. And I would risk my life to do it because that's what I do. That's important to me. But I couldn't do that. And of course, there were many reasons that the Israeli military gave for not allowing journalists to go in. They said it was security. Either way, you lose that verification.
But Emily, this has been like a long-standing issue with foreign reporters and foreign media. This time around, when we were listening to CBC, we were horrified with a one-side approach that they were taking.
Yes, and
as if people in Israel are not suffering at all. There's not like 4,000 rockets. It's all one-sided. So I understand what you're saying. I mean, this time around, the army was a little bit tricky with how they included the media, but do you see that as the only reason for their one-side approach?
Certainly not. And I think, one of the reasons I-24 even came about was that our CEO, who didn't live in Israel, he was managing media companies in Qatar, and he was a diplomat, but he wanted Israel's story. He was frustrated with that. He didn't want Israel's story to be told by foreign correspondents. He wanted to throw that into the mix and say, we're Israelis, we're Israeli Palestinians, we're Israeli Jews, we're Israeli Europeans, but we want to be able to tell the story as well. And that's why I think for any media, it's like a balanced diet. I would never live only off of fruit, and I would never live only off of CNN, right? I would try to get my news from many different sources, from the New York Times, from the Washington Post, from the Wall Street Journal, from CNN, from all those places. And I think I-24 News fits into that well-balanced diet because they can give you that perspective as well. And I saw that mission is very important. It's one of the reasons why I joined the company and love it so much. But I also think that, and you and I know the old story, right? And I know this personally because I served as an officer doing this, that Israel invests in life-saving infrastructure so that we don't absorb a lot of casualties, so that we save people's lives. We invest money in that, and Hamas invests a lot of money in destroying, and also they capitalize when Palestinian citizens in Gaza are killed. That's part of how they flourish. clearly this is a very, very long relationship. And if I look at what was happening on the ground, and I got that insight between how the Israeli military affiliates with the media, I wonder if there's if there's space for that relationship to change. You know, and I think Israel does a really good job about talking about a lot of the great things that it's doing, and that's really, really, really important. I think but there is still a misunderstanding of Hamas's role that it plays and how sort of terrifying it is in the Gaza Strip. I think that relationship is, you know, it's very long and it's very convoluted. And you will probably have more solutions to how to discuss that outwardly than I would. But when you see,
I don't know who's talking.
when you see that I can tell you that reporters here, you know, knowing them and speaking to them, and now, right, I've had
She talks, I can't, she talks so fast, I'm having trouble following.
Oh, sorry. I'll slow down. I'll speak very fast. I've seen now every side of the coin, in the sense that I know the foreign reporters here and the risks they take to go into Gaza and try to find out what really happened. I saw a great interview on Sky where he basically asked a Hamas commander, I mean, do you store weapons near the United Nations building? And he was like, yes, right?
So basically you're saying that Israel can do more to enhance the relationship with the media, with the foreign media, and to give them more input.
Listen, it's not my job, so I don't.
No, I know, I'm not. I'm just asking, you know, what can be done, because I know here we have we have honest reporting and all these people that are going after the media, but if that can be changed from within, you know, if that can be dealt with in Israel, then it might be a good place to start with changing the relationship.
I'll give you a bit of an inside look. I was trying to help a reporter here do a story about tunnels and tunnel infrastructure, because we attended an off-the-record military briefing, and the topic was tunnels. I won't go into details, but that was the topic. And she wanted to do a report about the tunnel infrastructure. And yes, the Israeli military had said that in Guardian of the Walls, which is already a horrible name for an operation if you're talking about the optics, but that in Guardian of the Walls, they were after Hamas's tunnel infrastructure. Netanyahu gave a press briefing to foreign diplomats where he showed the tunnel infrastructure. And I wanted to get someone from the Israeli military in that report on the record. I wanted to get a voice in the report. And they pushed around my request. And then in the end, it's not in it. So if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, right? If you're not going to give a quote, you do miss out on having your voice. And I think for a long time, Israel has said, we'd rather not say anything, or we'd rather stay out of it. But sometimes that's really the wrong move. I do hope that there's room for improvement on that level. Yes. And I will say that I don't think that coming at reporters from an angle of kind of like on attack mode is the best, most tactical way to sort of get your message in there. I look at the reporters that go into Gaza here, and they incur immeasurable risk. And that is because war, ultimately, you know, this was a war between Israel and Hamas. But the people who suffered, and yes, on both sides, were the civilians and the citizens. And you want people who are journalists and who are watching and who are verifying. You want people who are just there to watch, to verify, collect those.
Let's hope that the new Israeli government will foster their relationship with the press.
I really do hope so. But I can say now that it's on rough footing. That's how I would describe it from my
So I guess my last question was how hopeful you are, or what gives you hope maybe for the future here?
Well, you know, on Sunday, I went to Rabin Square to collect some interviews for about the new coalition. And I never thought that I would see people in Tel Aviv celebrating Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, because he is, you know, he's kind of firebrand, right wing, does not really fit with the community here. This is not his base. And I was very, it was moving to see that Israelis were talking about the divides in Israeli society and saying that's our main enemy, are the divides between peoples, the divides between Arabs and Jews, the divides between secular and religious, the divides between even men and women, or people who live in Tel Aviv versus people who live in the periphery. You know, those divides run very deep. And they were hopeful that this new coalition, because it is people who come from basically almost all spectrums of the political sort of rainbow, would be able to heal some of those divides. So that conversation definitely makes me hopeful. Hopeful, but tempered by caution, because like I say, you're still seeing a lot of youth who grew up with that bitterness in their mouth. And yes, here I'm talking about religious Jews, and I'm talking about Muslim citizens here, and I'm talking about Arab citizens here, Palestinians here.
Mm-hmm.
There's a very tense and loaded relationship with law enforcement. And I see a lot of the situation in the West Bank, unfortunately, not getting better. And like I said, more support for Hamas. That's not a good sign for me. If you look at liberal values or democracy, I don't see, for example, an Islamist party or a religious Jewish party as representing a lot of the democratic and sort of pluralistic values that I would want to see embodied going forward. There are, of course, a lot of pieces, for example, of Mansour Abbas's platforms that call for conversion therapy, for example, for homosexuals, or he praised the Hamas Charter at some point, and I don't see Naftali Bennett as being someone who embodies as well pluralistic or open values. I'm very worried about as well as policies in the West Bank. But yes, overall, that did give me a lot more hope than what I've seen in the past.
So I just want to thank you again, Emily, and to tell you again how proud I am of you, because you're a great, I think you represent the future, and I'm hoping that we will see you again and hear from you. And I also wish you good luck in Columbia University, and enjoy New York.
Thank you. I'll just say one last thing. For me, I was not experiencing the anti-Semitism that was raging across all of these different communities. That would have been very, very hard for me. So I know that all of you are fighting sort of the good fight over there. It's very sad for me as an Israeli to know that every time there's an escalation here, it impacts and ripples through Jewish communities across the world, and it brings up all of the sort of hatred that perhaps maybe it just didn't have an excuse to come out before, but it was there before, and now it has this kind of excuse to come out. That scares me, and I know that what we do here impacts there just as much as what you do over there impacts, Israelis greatly over here. That relationship is something that I think is I don't take it lightly. I'm not sure that a lot of Israelis actually understand that so much, because they haven't seen both sides, both here and there. But
let's remember, it's an excuse. It's not really the cause, it's just the excuse.
Yes, and I do believe, I think that reiterating that message, if criticizing Israel is anti-Semitism, or criticizing the Israeli government is anti-Semitism, then I'm certainly an anti-Semitic, because I criticize Israelis. We criticize everything.
No, but there is a difference between criticizing and denying Israel's right to exist.
That's right. And so I think that, I do really feel, like that was a very hard time. And I'm very sorry that everyone had to see that, or you had to experience that. I do hope that it is also a wake-up call that these kind of incidents are just, that anti-Semitism, maybe it was taking a nap and just finds this opportunity to wake up. I do hope that that's a wake-up call. And I also see I know a lot of Palestinian diaspora, and I know a lot of Palestinian Americans and even Palestinians here. And sometimes I look at the diaspora for both parties and I see that maybe, certainly during an escalation, it's a place for conflict, but during times of peace, it can be a place where, because the tension is, as I mentioned, I speak English. Sometimes when I go to Ramallah, because I can see that it just brings the tension down a few nods, you know. It can also, I think, be a ground zero for dialogue and for thinking about these problems together, and for talking about the things that we have in common, and for talking about the feeling, and this is a feeling that we all know, of having our existence denied, and the right to exist denied. And I know that as a Jew and a Jew in the diaspora and as an Israeli. I don't wish it upon anybody else. And so I think that conversation is a great place to start, because it's a unification factor. And I think that actually the diaspora is a really, maybe during those 10 days, 12 days or whatever, during that war, it was a horrible context for that, so don't even try. But the day after, that's the day when you can start talking about those things that unite us in common, the feeling of being afraid, the feeling of being denied your identity, and displaced. Certainly Jews know what it's like to be displaced. So, you know, that gives me hope in itself. So, yeah.
Can I just ask a question again, back to Sheikh Jarrah?
Sure.
You know, although in retrospect, I think it probably could have been resolved more amicably, and hopefully the Supreme Court will render a decision that will be fair and just, as I would think. But the question I have is, I'm not sure as to what I understand is that the tenants refused to pay their rent, and there was grounds for expulsion or displacement from their homes, just like Israelis that don't pay their rent in an apartment block under those circumstances are displaced as well, or is it more complicated than that?
Yeah, it's yeah, go ahead.
From a legal basis.
The initial legal basis of the investigation was a group from actually an American group, that had claimed that this was land that actually belonged to Jews before 48 and thus should be returned. So that was the legal claim that I saw. Whether there were issues about the rent, I'm not sure. You have to remember it's also different. It's not exactly all the same family, right? We're talking about 4 different homes and different families, and there are several families or several family members living in each home. So I didn't see that the rent was the main issue, but there is a lobbying group who has taken this claim, which has now gone to the Supreme Court, about who owns this, you know, property, these properties, these homes. Anything when you talk about Jerusalem, it's always between a rock and a hard place, because the Palestinian Authority likes to assert power there, and it's up against the Israeli Authority. So, you know, there were talks that they wanted to go into a deal about owning the land, but the Palestinian Authority intimidated them not to. There are those, I've heard a myriad of people saying that that group that made that claim is supported by Likud, and they wanted to sort of start, you know, you've heard every claim here, you know, from every side. Nothing that I've been able to verify so far, but I think the official legal claim was that it was owned by Jews.
Okay, Emily, I want to thank you again on behalf of Winnipeg Friends of Israel, and we hope to see you again. You'll be a guest on our in our talks. I just want to remind everyone that on Thursday, the 24th, we're going to host Mike Fagelman from now I forget, from Honest Reporting Canada. So you're welcome to join us. And have a good Father's Day, everyone. Enjoy your time with your family, and we'll see you again soon.
Emily, I have one more question.
All right. Okay, Bradley can stay with Emily.
Just one more, I promise you.
Sure.
Why is it that journalists internationally accept the Hamas charter, where they say specifically, we'll find every Jew behind every stone and tree, and we will slay them? Why is that acceptable? Yet, if there was any other nationality or race that was in which sentiments were targeted in such a way, they would be struck like a thunderbolt.
Yeah, unfortunately, we've seen this media equation, and you can see, I mean, the Israeli military and Israel is not just it's a global powerhouse, right? And so the equation that's been drawn is that Israel is this overbearing power, and Hamas is actually very weak. And that is a political Islam tactic. If we're talking about terror organizations, Hezbollah uses that tactic. Daesh and the Islamic Caliphate use that tactic. This is a tactic that we see used over and over again to try to draw this global equation. And it's an equation that, yeah, I agree with you, has been accepted by many as sort of the standard. And you and I know that in Gaza, Palestinians are basically prisoners of Hamas. They live under horrible conditions. But I wouldn't paint the media all with one brush, because again, the New York Times did this incredible story, which was so on point. And I know the reporter who did a story about Hamas recruiting young people and them lying and saying that the soldiers or the Hamas, I guess, militants who were killed by Israel, they gave the ages. And then when they looked into it and they went to verify, the ages of some of those militants were 16 and 17, and that is child warfare, and that's illegal, right? That's against international law. So I wouldn't paint, that's what I'm saying, I wouldn't paint all of the journalists with these one brush, and I agree with you that equation is completely misconstrued at best, right? A misunderstanding at best. But if you look at a lot of the coverage that came out of this, I would tend to look at a lot of the stories, because I can tell you that I know a lot of very pro-Palestinian people who are also quite very anti-Israel people, yeah? And they very much make the claim that the media is biased against them. It's very interesting for me to see, right? Because I'm talking to you all, and I know that you feel this way, and you have the right to feel this way. And I'm talking to them, and they're saying they're all biased and they're pro-Israel, all the media is against us too. So it's interesting to see that both sides kind of claim that way. And then you're talking to the guy in East Jerusalem, and he's like, the Palestinian cause is finally on the map. They're finally seeing that a Palestinian can be evicted by Israel and can be bombed by Israel. So you're seeing kind of every different perspective. But I would tend to draw on those articles. And you know what gives it even more clout? It's like if someone tells you, if someone starts to draw that equation to you and say, well, look at this New York Times article, because it's the New York Times, which is normally very, very critical of Israel. And they came out with an article that said that Hamas is taking children, and using them as soldiers. Like, is that okay? Would that be okay for you if your 16-year-old kid was recruited and used as a child soldier, as a child militant? And it's the New York Times, so you can't say that it's working for the Israeli government, right? So I would tend to look on that coverage, and I wouldn't paint all of the reporters.
No, it's not all. But,
yeah.
Thank you, Emily and Bradley. If anybody has more questions, I'm willing to collect them and send them to Emily for the future, if you don't mind, Emily.
Glad to.
I know somebody, and I think he's here, John Froze, asked me about the Israeli blockade. Maybe I can ask you later, and maybe you can help me understand more about it.
Yeah.
I can send you the question, and maybe we can figure it out together. And again, have a happy Father's Day and enjoy your time with family. And thanks, Emily, again. Bye.
thank you very much, Emily.
My pleasure. Take care.
It was very